Has the pendulum already swung in favor of Iran? Tehran and Washington treating 2 days of face-to-face talks in Geneva as a never-seen-in-3 decades meeting. Point of fact, there have already been plenty of bilateral discussions over Iran's nuclear ambitions. We're going to look at the stakes and at just how badly both sides want a deal. Hard to imagine this a year ago. Hard then to imagine Iran's president on a first official visit to Turkey since 1996. But with the tide turning in favor of Tehran's protege in Syria, Bashar al-Assad, and Ankara and the Gulf states now trying to rein in radicals that are taking part in that Syrian conflict, pragmatism seems to be trumping ideology as Sunni Turkey and Shiite Iran bury the hatchet of sorts. Tehran may have the wind in its sails on foreign policy, but with year-on inflation still well above 25%, the honeymoon period could quickly be over if Hassan Rouhani ultimately fails to deliver. Is the normalization of ties inevitable with Iran's neighbors and with the West? Today in the France 24 debate, is it advantage Iran? With us to talk about it from Washington, Reza Marashi. He's research director at the National Iranian American Council, also in the U.S. Capitol. Patrick Clausen, director of research at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Welcome to both you gentlemen. Welcome as well to Alexandre Sudron, who's with the, what do we call it, the French Economic Circle for Iran? Something.
Iran. Cercle Iran Economy.
And you were one of the ones spearheading when those French businessmen went to Tehran. Maybe we'll talk about it a little bit later on. And also joining us, two journalists who know Tehran fairly well, you might say. Claude van Engeland, thank you for being with us. And thanks as well to France 24's very own Sanam Chantier. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter, our hashtag F24Debate. In Tehran, where everyone is feeling the bite of sanctions, opinions run the gamut on those talks that are taking place for a second day in Geneva.
I'm very optimistic, and my hope is that both our officials and American officials see the full half of the glass.
Well, I am hopeful, and we should be. If these talks have a positive effect in eliminating the sanctions, then this will bring about progress and improvement.
The Iranians have shown their goodwill so far, but the Americans, I don't think so. The Americans have always been bullies and have always tried to impose their will. There might be a conclusion reached on the Iranian side, but I don't think we can get anywhere on the American side.
All right, fair gamut there of opinions. Reza Marashi, what's your feeling about the perception of these talks?
Well, I think perception often breeds reality, and that's why you've seen both sides go out and try to paint these talks in a very positive light. Because the fact of the matter is they've made unprecedented progress. We're closer to a deal today than we've ever been before. That doesn't mean that it's going to happen. It means nothing is guaranteed. It means that both sides are closer today than they were even 1 year ago to making very painful compromises in order to achieve a peaceful, durable solution to this long-standing conflict.
What are those painful compromises?
Well, I think on the Iranian end, it's very serious and verifiable limitations to the construct of their nuclear program. And, you know, some of these concessions they were willing to make 10, 15 years ago, but many of them are new. A lot of new things have come up in the discussion. Now, what those actual concessions look like are going to depend on the negotiations themselves. As the negotiators from both sides have said, the talks are kind of like a Rubik's Cube, where if you move one piece, then it moves a bunch of other pieces that you need to align perfectly in order for the deal to work out. On the American side, of course, it means lifting sanctions and acknowledging that there's going to be enrichment on Iranian soil at the end of the day when a comprehensive deal is signed.
All right. Patrick Clausen, do you see this general will leading towards a good deal?
Well, the discussions are about the nuclear impasse, and that at the moment it appears that the two sides were surprised at how far apart they were when they actually sat down last month to discuss specific numbers. And so it's not clear if there's going to be a deal by the July 20th deadline, but there seems to be a strong will on the two sides to continue exploring things if they can't reach a deal by July 20th.
Are you upbeat on these talks?
Well, let's just simply say I discussed this matter with several delegations that are talking about it in Europe today.
And?
As I say, there's quite a gap between the numbers that were being offered by the two sides on several key points. There's some other issues on which they're closer to reaching agreement. And there's a surprise that the two sides each thought that in fact they would be closer by now than they are. So that while there's been a lot of progress made, there still are some gaps. Unless there's quite a bit of movement on, and I think that most of the movement's going to have to be by the Iranian side. The P5+1 countries, the permanent 5 members of the UN plus China, or as they're usually referred to in Europe, the E3+3, the European 3 plus Russia, China, and the United States, are pretty agreed that Iran's going to have to reduce the number of centrifuges from what it now has, whereas Iran is insisting that it be allowed to substantially expand the number of centrifuges it has. So Reza's quite right that the P5+1 have agreed that Iran can have centrifuges at the end of the day. The number of centrifuges still has to be agreed upon, and the P5+1 are insisting on a lot fewer than at present, because they insist that Iran has to be kept at least 6 to 12 months away from having a nuclear weapon, so that if Iran were to make a breakout towards a nuclear weapon, we would have 6 to 12 months advance warning.
All right. Do you agree, Claude Van Engelen, that it's up to Tehran now to make the next heavy concessions?
Well, my Iranian contact do say, well, it's up to the West, it's up to the Europeans and the Americans to make concessions. So, well...
a classic bargain.
A classic bargain. We're at a stage, it's a turning point in the negotiation. It's the point where everyone has to show that it's extremely difficult to find a deal and to raise the stakes. So the coming weeks are going to be very important. But the Iranians say, well, we're ready for controls, but the number of centrifuges that have been submitted to us are totally unacceptable. So I would say, well, yes, we have made a step forward. I mean, the Iranians accept to discuss, but the numbers remain still a big question.
All right, a wrinkle, by the way, added by the French foreign minister on the radio earlier. Laurent Fabius guarded as to Tehran's true intentions.
There is still a very worrying reactor in Iraq, which is said to produce plutonium, and we've seen, if there's the necessary will, how to transform this plutonium reactor so that it doesn't yield an atomic bomb. And we're still hitting a wall on one absolutely fundamental point, which is the number of centrifuges.
All right, Iraq. Tell us why this is so important here.
Iraq has been a major sticking point, but it's one of the points that Iran actually did make a concession on. They agreed to redesign the heavy water reactor, which would have otherwise been capable of producing bomb material. So I think that we can see Iran's commitment on a number of levels. We had President Rouhani say earlier today that Iran will do its best for a final deal with the P5+1 group. And although there have been a number of sticking points that they need to bridge, we can see that the commitment remains there. We see that the negotiations are taking place between Tehran and Washington at the moment. We have a French delegation meeting the Iranians on Wednesday, and that will be followed by the Russian officials. So the stakes continue to be high, and I think we can still remain positive.
The commitment on the principles remain. It's a discussion of figures for the time being.
All right, but the devil's in the detail, as they often say. Let me ask you at this point, when you see the tone of these negotiations at this particular point in time, is it a given that there'll be a deal?
I think the negotiation is historical because the high-level talks, it's the first time that Americans and Iranians meet in Geneva. I think the economical program of the Rouhani government is important because it clearly wants to improve the Iranian economy, and he wants to change the situation. When we see for example, the public sphere in Iran, it's when a government in Iran speaks about privatization or major economical things like that, it's not.
So are you suggesting because there is this pressure at home, that there's more pressure on the Iranians than the Americans to strike a deal at this point?
I think the situation in Iran is clearly awful. We can say that Iranian economy is in a tough situation, and they need to have serious reform. And in Middle East, you need to have another position from Occidental countries. We saw that the economical sanction, has been not a really successful, because in fact Iran changed strategy, and regarding to new contact with East, they managed to have some economical life. But I think now the both parties clearly needs an agreement.
Patrick Clausen, who needs this more, the Iranians or the Americans?
Well, for some time, it was thought by political operatives here that President Obama was very eager for a deal going into the U.S. midterm elections in November. But his political operatives have decided in the last 2 months that, in fact, any deal reached with the Iranians is likely to be heavily criticized by the political opposition here at home. And so that therefore Obama would not get much domestic political advantage in the midterm elections from a deal. So the Obama team has decided that it'd be nice to have a deal, but it's by no means a political imperative. And so the U.S. attitude now towards a deal is much more relaxed than it was a few months ago. The attitude now is, well, if it happens, that's fine. But if the Iranians are insisting on too tough terms, then we'll let the Iranians sit for a while, because the Iranians are the ones who are going to need this deal more than the United States. And they will eventually realize that and come around to a position which is more like that, which was being talked about for quite some time, when it was clearly understood by both parties that there had to find a way that Iran would be 6 to 12 months away from a bomb. And Iran's going to have to agree to the conditions that make that possible.
Reza Marashi, do you read the situation the same way?
No, I mean, I think that's a great talking point, and it plays very well to try and put public pressure on the Iranians. But in the bigger scheme of things, are we really going to believe that a major foreign policy breakthrough with a country that we've been estranged with for over 3 decades could be seen as weakness in the run-up to an American election by Democrats? I find that to be hard to believe, and I think most people who look at it objectively and honestly are going to find that hard to believe as well. In the bigger scheme of things, in the negotiations right now, both sides are posturing. The Iranians are doing it, the United States are doing it. Neither side thinks they're weak. They both think they have the upper hand. The reality is that neither side is as strong as they believe themselves to be. In the run-up to the Geneva interim deal, they waited until the 11th hour to play their final cards to secure that deal. I think we're going to see a somewhat similar process, even if they have to go past the soft deadline of July 20th and extend it by a couple of weeks or months. This is the reality of the situation. Both sides need the deal because they've escalated the conflict to the point where the only options they have left are increasingly dangerous and can serve as a tripwire to war. And we should be clear about that.
But playing to Patrick Clausen's argument is this talk now that it won't be until at least December before there's a final deal.
That's possible, but it has very little to do with American domestic politics and very much to do with just how many very complicated issues they're trying to untangle. The domestic political will on both sides is there now. It gets infinitely more difficult for both sides politically if they go past the July 20th deadline, and that's why they've brought in the A-team on the American side and the A-team on the Iranian side to try to seal this deal by July 20th.
Sanem Shantieh, let's talk about the A-team on the American side. It's led by William Burns, who's a longtime diplomat and who's retiring in September.
Absolutely. We have William Burns, who we know that, although unofficially they had backdoor talks with the Iranians, which essentially secured the interim agreement, which is due to expire on July the 20th. We have William Burns, who's due to retire, and we have Ashton. But I don't think that's anything to worry about. Both sides are trying to manage expectations in that they've said that they may be pushing beyond this July 20th deadline. But it seems that there is still an interest in trying to get this agreement signed. And it's not just the Iranians that require this because of the backbreaking sanctions, but the US as well. Iran no longer needs to pose as a threat to them with its nuclear program.
No longer needs to pose as a threat. But when you look at those diplomats that are retiring, you mentioned as well Catherine Ashton, the two of them leaving, does that leave the West in a weaker bargaining position if they're replaced by people who perhaps haven't followed this as closely?
I don't necessarily think so, because we can see that the Obama administration, although some may disagree, have been driving this, and they want this to go through. And before the last round of the nuclear talks, which took place in Vienna, we had the US delegation head over to Israel to potentially get the green light from them as well. So it's not just the US and the P5+1 group that need to be appeased here, but we need to set Israel's mind at ease as well.
Claude Van Engelen, Catherine Ashton sometimes gets a bit of a rough ride in the press, but on the issue of the Iranian negotiations, what would you say her role has been?
She's been very good. She's been very good, and I think she plays an important role. There's even a joke that says that President Rouhani wants the deal plus Ashton during the signature. No. Ashton succeeded in building confidence between the various participants around the table. So she has been very, very good. The Iranians trust her, and I think the Western side trusts her as well. So she's an important person in the negotiation. But she's going to stay until December. So, and her team is going to stay with her. So they're going to be around. Let me add that I believe that the Iranians would like an agreement, but they won't take an agreement at any cost. And it is important to always remember that the Iranian society is a tribal society. Of course, they're suffering from the embargo, but in tribal societies, when someone loses one's job, she can always go to see the parents, the grandparents, the extended relatives, and so on. So they're quite flexible, so they can endure a lot, and they're very resilient. So I think it's one of the trump cards.
Tehran can tough it out as well, you're saying. We're going to pick up on that point when we come back. You're watching the France 24 debate.